Sandeep's going to talk for a bit, because for a smaller audience, he's going to open it up to your questions and have more of a conversation. Just FYI, as I'm speaking, if you want to think about that, that'd be fantastic. Afterwards, our friends from Charm City Books are outside selling books. If you haven't bought a book, so Sandeep would be like to send your book. I also want to thank the John Hopkins Alzheimer's Disease Research Center and the Alzheimer's Association Greater Maryland chapter for being here. They have information tables outside here. If you want any information on either organization, they can provide. They'd be happy to answer any of your questions. And finally, we have several programs coming up in April, May, and June. The full list is outside. You can also find it at prattlibrary.org. I encourage you to go check it out. There's something there for everybody. Tonight, I'm happy to welcome Dr. Sandeep Jauhar to the Pratt Library to discuss his latest book, My Father's Brain, Life in the Shadows of Alzheimer's. In it, he looks at Alzheimer's disease, which afflicts over 6 billion Americans, or 1 in 10 people over the age of 65, through the lens of his father's diagnosis. Sandeep Jauhar is a practicing cardiologist and director of the heart failure program at Long Island Jewish Medical Center. He is a regular contributor to the New York Times opinion section and the best-selling author of several books, including Part of History. Author Lucy Pollock called My Father's Brain honest and compelling, combining the professional and the personal in a story that is both gripping and desperately sad. Anyone who has loved and cared for someone with dementia will recognize their own creeping realization that something is wrong. He attempts to explain away bizarre behaviors, the moments of frustration and shame, triggers eye-rolls made by cars and trying to convey to strangers his father was no longer himself. Neurosurgeon and best-selling author Sanjay Gupta commented, blending humor, compassion, and building family bonding illustrated memoir with expert science writing, Sandeep Jauhar has composed a candid introduction to what has been called the Age of Alzheimer's. And finally, in Publishers Weekly Starred Review, they wrote, the author's brutal honesty, father's decline, and his own inability to fully reckon with it, is expertly accompanied by rigor. Every family who's ever faced an Alzheimer's diagnosis will see themselves in exceptional work. On a personal note, I did as well. My mother passed in her early 60s, and talking to Sandeep in the green room just prior, and it's not lost on me how similar my journey was. His my grief was full. So, can everyone hear me okay? Great. So, well, it's a pleasure to be here. This is actually my first book event for the group. So, I feel very fortunate to get started on the book tour with you. Um, so, it's a nice small gathering, so we should really have more conversation. I did prepare some remarks, but I think I'm going to sort of jump it a little bit and just talk a little bit about the book. Um, and maybe you have your own questions that you'd like to answer. And we can just talk about that. Maybe a more effective way to get you what you need, what you want. Right here. So, um, My Father's Brain is my fourth book. It is a memoir of my relationship with my father as he succumbed to dementia. But it's also a book about the history and science of brain and memory and brain degeneration. So I sort of combine this personal writing with science writing, which, in a sense, I think is sort of an, an, an in homage to my father, because my father um, tolerated at best my interest in writing. Uh, he
was a world-class scientist, and he really wanted me to become a doctor. And I was really interested in writing and sort of literature, humanities, philosophy when I was growing up. And so he said it was fine that I pursue those interests, but I had to have a pragmatic dimension to my career, which basically meant you better go to medical school. And you want to write, go ahead. But I want you to have a career that you can sort of have, have some stability with. And um, so I think, the book is really a combination of science, which my father really always wanted me to sort of master and embrace. And then there's the memoir, personal writing, um, which, I think is probably the major thrust of the book. It's really more of a narrative, nonfiction. Uh, so, you know, the story sort of starts in 2014 um, when my parents were thinking about moving to New York to live closer to me and my brother. My parents lived in Fargo, North Dakota. I didn't grow up there. Uh, uh, they were, my father was a wheat geneticist, actually a really well known. He created the first, um, well, he worked on conferring scab resistance to wheat crop plants in general, and he used sort of advanced molecular techniques to introduce genes from different species of plants into crop plants. So and other plants. So he for example, created he took a gene from a tomato plant, injected it into a wheat plant to have the wheat plant express some of the favorable sort of genetic traits of the tomato. He got a lot of recognition for that, right after the Wall Street Journal and so on. So he was a very active scientist. But in 2014, um, problems arose, and it really wasn't with my father; it was more with my mother. She was declining from Parkinson's disease. Yeah, so my family was just cursed with neurodegenerative. My mother sort of started developing Parkinsonian symptoms probably about 4 years prior, like 2010 or so. And by the time 2014 came around, my father was kind of getting ready to retire, but he didn't really want to. My brother and I were pushing him. You need to like retire and move closer to us because mom is getting worse, and I'm not sure you can really take care of her. You're getting older yourself. Um, so at one point, he finally decided, yes, okay, we're going to move. Um, but that was a whole thing because, you know, I think my parents really wanted to live closer to my sister. My mother was very close to her daughter, my sister. Um, but I don't think their culture, Indian culture, allowed them to rely on a daughter and a son-in-law in their old age. And so my brother and I were like the next best option, basically. And there's some irony to that because actually in Indian culture, it's the sons who are supposed to take care of the parents. So India has really no social security, social safety net to speak of. Um, it's basically having a son. And it's not even the son, it's the son's wife, right? Who's going to take care of it. So that was basically like the culture, but but they you know they didn't really. I think their preference would have been to sort of break out of that cultural straitjacket, move with my sister. But in the end, they decided to move closer to my brother and me. Um, and we noticed around that time that things were changing with my dad. Right, he was doing sort of these odd things. Like for example, 2 years before he moved, he called me and he said, um, "The people at work want me to write 2 scientific papers a year." I said, "Okay, that shouldn't be a big deal for you." He had written hundreds, and some of the best scientific journals, but he was really worried about it. And now, in retrospect, he knew there was something wrong. He was worried. We only found out later that there were much more sort of stark um, evidence of his cognitive deterioration. One of his friends told me after my parents moved to Long Island that my father got lost driving home from work. Same laboratory he'd been working in for 20 some years. And it was only about 5 miles from his house. And so that was just really bizarre. And, we were living far away from our parents and didn't really, and we had our own active sort of lives. My brother's also a doctor. We had very active careers, family, our own families, and um, so um, so we didn't really know what was going on. And then later, I found out that my mother had stopped cooking, and my parents were eating cereal for dinner. These are things that we might have known if there was sort of proximity. And we did find out after they moved. After they moved, my father was sort of there were just some bizarre things like he kept forgetting the code to the safe that we bought him. You know, um, it was 1941, my mother's, you know, um, birth year, and he kept forgetting. I was like, this is really bizarre. He got lost driving home from Sears after moving to Long Island. Now, that in and of itself wasn't such a big deal, but what he did was incredibly bizarre. He stopped the car on the main road. I wouldn't say it's a highway, but it's a very busy road. He stopped it right on the main road, got out, and tried to flag cars, ask them where he should go. Well, my mother kept saying, "Call, call Sandeep," you know, but he didn't want to. I think he was hiding things. Um, and he started watching a lot of television, which had always been not something he'd really been that interested in. And um, so um, he grew up in a very impoverished way in India, and had always been very frugal with his money. Um, but now he was bouncing checks. Uh, so some of that behavior might be familiar to some people in the room if you've had relatives with Alzheimer's. It was incredibly bizarre for us, and I think we were all in denial. Um, you know, I sort of attributed, or maybe wanted to attribute it to the stress of moving, because I didn't really know what was going on in Fargo. Um, so, uh, so I'd say, let's get them some friends and maybe a social network, and you'll bounce out of it. It was actually my mother who was having a really hard time walking by then. She was still totally mentally with it. But her motor function was incredibly compromised, um, which was complementary to my father in the end. His neurodegenerative process was cognitive, motor function was totally fine. So that was bizarre. But she took me aside one day. We'd gone for a walk, and she said, she was telling me about some of the things my dad was doing, and she just stopped and looked at me, and she's like, "Do you think your father has Alzheimer's?" And uh, and that was the first time the word had been uttered in our house. We'd really been in denial for months, um, because we, like a lot of families, didn't want to acknowledge the fact that there could be something like Alzheimer's. Uh, you know, uh, the physician and essayist Lewis Thomas called dementia the worst of all diseases, and and my mother definitely would have agreed with that. Um, to her, the decline and the eventual need for institutional help, that was like the worst possible thing. And polls show that people uh, fear Alzheimer's more than cancer. They actually fear Alzheimer's more than death itself. So we weren't alone. We took my dad to a neurologist, and he did some neurocognitive testing, did a mini mental status exam, and found that he had what he called MCI, mild cognitive impairment. Now, I'm a doctor. I went to medical school. I'm a heart doctor, but I took neurology classes. I rotated on the neurology board. I didn't even really know what MCI was. Um, but what I learned, and what I write about in the book, is it's a sort of pre-dementia. Um, a significant portion of people who have this pre-dementia go on to develop Alzheimer's, but not everyone. Sometimes the disease process gets arrested, and we don't know why some people progress and others don't. So we didn't really know what was going to happen, but we kind of did, right? Because the behaviors were progressive and they were clearly out of the norm. This wasn't just a simple like senior moment, right, where you don't remember someone's name. This is much more profound. Um, I'm just going to read you a very short selection from the book, just to give you an idea of what the well, a little bit of the tone of the book, but then also what we were contending with. So shortly after my father went to his neurologist, we put him on a drug called Aricept to bolster his memory. We were we went for a walk. So I'll just read. One day during my parents' first winter on Long Island, a few weeks after the visit to Dr. Gordon, my father and I went for a walk. The sun was shining brightly that day, fluorescing off the white drifts to either side of us. The snow had come early that year. It was now melting into a kind of grayish honeycomb along the footpath. Cars and driveways were blanketed in frost. Pellets of road salt crackled under our shoes. You tripped here, remember? I said, pointing to where the sidewalk was jutting up. My father nodded. He remained a handsome man with his meticulously trimmed salt and pepper mustache, appearing 20 years younger than his age. That afternoon, he was wearing a red sweater under his bomber jacket. A green cap and earmuffs covered his head. I was running, he recalled, of the brief stumble that fortunately had not resulted in injury. Actually, he had been walking. It was dark. You must not go out when it's dark, I admonished. I've told you before. I should go with Pia, he said, laughing. When will you bring her? I brought her last weekend. No, he cried. I did. Well, you should bring her more often. She's a lovely child. I told him I would. I didn't have the heart to tell him that his beloved granddaughter rarely wanted to visit anymore. He stopped to blow his nose with his fingers, leaving a string of snot on the wet snow. Come on, let's go back, he said. We had walked about a block. You don't want to walk some more? No, I'm tired, he said, turning around. Then, as if on cue, the tape rewound. So, when will you bring Pia? So, what I learned was that this inability to remember current events is characteristic of Alzheimer's disease. Alzheimer's usually, not always, affects a part of the brain called the hippocampus, which is involved in the retention of current experience. Basically, it's the part of the brain that um, takes experiences, events, or facts and um, sort of indexes them, takes, like, let's say you experience something, an event, going to, having a nice meal. So there are different sensations. There's the sight of the food, there's the taste of it, there's the smell of it, there's the time that it occurred, there's the the conversation with people that you're listening to and the facts that they're telling you. All that information goes to the hippocampus, and it kind of um, compresses it into a cohesive whole. And then, usually during sleep, it replays that to the part of the brain called the cortex, which is the main part of the brain that is involved in, executive function, judgment, and so on. And that replay often occurs during sleep. That's why you need sleep to remember stuff. Um, uh, I'm actually very sleep deprived. This is my book launch week, and this is why I'm not remembering things. So yeah, so but yeah, so the cortex then sort of eventually develops a long-term memory. So you have this long-term memory. So let's say Alzheimer's starts. It affects the hippocampus, which prevents you from creating new experience, new memories. So you might forget what you had for lunch. You actually might remember what you had for lunch on April 12th, 1953, because I don't know, it was a special event. And that memory is in the cortex. And the cortex doesn't get affected by Alzheimer's except at very, very late stages. So that's why people um, with Alzheimer's frequently will remember childhood events from, when they got married or sort of a young adulthood, um, but they won't remember what they had for lunch or whether they had lunch. Um, I tell you this because for me, understanding Alzheimer's was key to my caregiving because, I think of myself as a rational person. And when my father would behave irrationally, I would get incredibly frustrated and impatient. Um, and it was only, and unfortunately, a lot of what I learned happened after I had displayed a lot of impatience. But and that's one of the reasons I wrote the book, is so people understand why are these things happening. There is neurological substrate for it. You know, I used to think my dad was putting me on. You know, I when he would say he'd behave terribly, and he'd deny it, or where he would act like he just wasn't aware of uh, transgressions he had made, and it wasn't memory; it was part of it. It was also just like um, a kind of self-awareness of his mental state. He didn't have it. Um, and I learned that Alzheimer's eventually affects parts of the brain um, called the parietal lobe and the frontal lobe. And those are the areas that are involved in the sense of awareness of yourself. So when that goes, you don't even know you're sick. You don't even know there's something wrong. He had no clue. He thought the problem was with me, you know? And that's incredibly frustrating as a caregiver. And so for me, I had to, you know, I wanted, I needed to learn about the disease. So So I think that was intimately one aspect of my caregiving and how I was able to do it. Anyway, my siblings and I became one of the 15 million or so family caregivers for elderly adults in this country. And like them, we had no training. We had very little time. We we weren't sure how much sacrifice we could make, right, to do the caregiving. Um, and I write in the book that being sick and elderly in this country is horrifying. Having a sick and elderly family member is a full-time job. So um, now we were fortunate in that we had some financial resources to hire help. Most Americans don't have those resources, and so they can't really hire a lot of help. So they have to do it themselves, and that can be incredibly taxing. Caregivers sometimes die before people they're caring for because of all the stress. Um, and there's also a lot of financial stress. So, like, I mean, we know that in this country, we don't really care properly for our elderly citizens. Um, unlike other countries, we don't have a proper social safety net. So, um, but unlike India, for example, where there's no sort of government social safety net, there's a cultural safety net. You know, people, it's part of the culture. You take care of your parents. You know, but in America, we don't really have that culture. Maybe we did in the past. Um, in maybe 100 years ago, a lot of Americans lived in multi-generational homes, often on farms. And there were, you know, you sort of uh, knew there were enough people around to help out when the relatives. Nowadays, kids grow up and they go out and blaze their own path, and women work outside the home now. Obviously, those are incredibly important and beneficial, right? But it comes at a cost. And the cost is that when people need help, there are very few people around. So the burden is borne by like one or two people. Let's face it, a daughter, right? That's essentially what it boils down to. I'm not saying that sons don't care for their elderly parents, they do, but it's very often women who bear that burden. Um, so, it's very taxing. And I think dementia care costs about $200 billion a year. Medicare pays 11 billion out of that 200 billion. So the rest of it is borne by family. And it's really hard. And you know, I didn't know how hard it was until I went through it. Uh, yeah, it was a very difficult journey. And you know, uh, it's a tragic story. So, if you think it's going to be a big surprise, there isn't. I knew it from the beginning. I knew when I write this in the book, I knew the battle was going to be lost. The only question was how much was going to be sacrificed in the defeat, right? How much dignity, how much, and it was very difficult. Um, you know, I learned a lot of different things in the course of my research. and just sort of thinking about dementia and how we treat dementia in this country. Um, One is that we isolate and marginalize people with dementia because we have a what others have called a hypercognitive culture. Right? This is a culture where we prize thinking, economic productivity, um, information. Right? Our world is swirling with information constantly. Um, that's what drives so much of our society. If you can't cope with information, you become marginalized. And that's what happened to my father. Um, Not just from the outside world, but really from his own family. We uh, had, you know, we had a very hard time uh, connecting with him, right? I mean, how do you connect with someone who sort of doesn't follow the rules, who can't remember the past, what you've done? I mean, so much of the time we spend with people is discussing shared experience, but when one person who loses, it's very hard to connect. And I think that disconnection actually worsens dementia. Loneliness worsens dementia. People who are lonely have a much higher risk of developing dementia. They have a higher risk of progressive dementia, um, which is horrible track. Um, there were aspects of uh, caregiving that I found troubling, like like learning to lie to my father. Um, as a doctor, I sort of believed and still believe in sort of honest, open communication with your patients. You don't lie to them. Um, Doctors used to lie quite a bit, uh, not in a bad, well, in a paternalistic way. You know, like they'd withhold bad news, right? It wasn't lying for their own benefit. It was lying for what they perceived to be the benefit of their patient. But it was a paternalistic act. And uh, so I, unlike my siblings, I had a harder time lying to my father. So they would tell him stuff, and a big thing, and I wrote about this in an essay in the New York Times. I don't know if any of you saw that essay, but it came out about a week ago. Um, when my father got Alzheimer's, I had to learn to lie to him or something like that. That was the title. But it was an excerpt from the book, and it was an adapted excerpt. It wasn't a straight excerpt. But you know, what I struggled with was that, you know, I believe that to have a connection with someone, and to be, um, with my father, to maintain that connection, to have him still be part of my world, I had to be straight with him. If I lied to him uh, constantly, even for his own benefit, that something was going to be lost in our relationship. And that's how I saw it. My brother and sister didn't see it that way. So he would get very upset, for example, that the live-in caregiver that we were paying for, actually he was paying for because he had retirement um, money, uh, he thought that she shouldn't be paid. He knew she was working, but he said, and he would get incredibly upset when he would learn that she'd been paid. And my brother would say, "You're not being paid. You're working for free." Um, and I would say, "Why do you have to tell him that? Just tell him. I would say, Dad, she's working for you. She's cooking your meals. She's washing your clothes. What do you expect? And he'd say, she should, she's eating my food. She's living in my house. She should just work for just food and shelter, no money. I said, Dad, you know that doesn't work that way. I would try to reason with him, but he'd get very, very upset. And I realized eventually it came to a head. I write about this in chapter 9, um, when he kicked her out of the house, and I knew she was really one of the heroes of the story. I knew that if she left, that he was going to end up in a locked memory unit. And so, I made the decision that to look my father in the eye and say, she's not being paid. She's working for free. Um, and, there are other times. My mother died in 2016. My mother had Parkinson's. And he, around maybe 2019, 2019 or so, he started saying, "Where's your mom?" And I'd say, "Mom died." What? What are you talking about? Where's she? And and uh, and I was obstinate about it. It would come up again, maybe a week later. Where's your mom? Mom died. You know, she's gone. How do you know she's gone? Because I went to her funeral. You went to her funeral? I said, so did you. That was just like horrific. But I was just in a blind spot. My brother would say, um, one time he said, uh, um, "Mom's on a plane flying over here." Oh, okay, good. He was happy. Can you call her? He's like, no, of course I can't call her. She's on the plane. You know, and then he would forget. That was a more merciful way of doing it. But I had a very hard time with it. Um, uh, I In the book we talk about going to a um, dementia village in the Netherlands that uses this sort of therapeutic deception in the structure of the facility. So they have like these homes where, you know, that are sort of designed to match the preferences of the residents before they move to the nursing home. Sort of the kind of lifestyle that the residents have, and they have caretakers who sort of pretend that they're the gardeners. They're just watching over these patients, these residents who have dementia. And the residents are allowed to wander around, like the whole village. They can go wherever they want to go. There's always someone around to help them. And so that sounded like a great thing, but I remember thinking, and I remember talking to my guide about it, and I remember saying, "But isn't this all just fake, right? It's like the Truman Show, the movie The Truman Show. It's like a stage set. Isn't there something like fundamentally dishonest about that approach?" Um, it's a wonderful place, and I was really asking more as an intellectual argument. And he said, "It's not lying. It's dealing with dementia the way it is." You know, so if someone uh, wanted to go home, you tell them you can wait at this fake bus stop for the bus. They'll take you home, and they wait and wait until they get tired, and it's like they're like, "Please bus stop," and then they forget. You know, it's that sort of approach, uh, which has its own issues, and so I analyze a lot of that sort of the ethics of it in the book. Um, that's one caregiving strategy. I mean, there's so much more I could say. I don't know what time, longer than I expected. So you know what? I'm going to stop there and take questions, and we're going to wrap up. And I'm happy to sign any books if anyone wants me to sign. So I'll take questions, or you can ask your questions up the table, whatever you want. Yeah, I mean, so yes. Um, so let's just talk about lifestyle changes. So I think there is evidence that exercise and movement, physical movement, is beneficial for brain health. That we've known for a long time. And there is some evidence that it can sort of retard the progression of dementia. Unclear if it's going to eliminate it. I think anything that creates cognitive reserve is um, is key, because when Alzheimer's basically kills brain cells. Some people start with more brain cells. Some people start with less. And by brain cells, I mean, synaptic connections. And so the more educated you are, the higher density of synaptic connections, um, the longer it's going to take before you get visibly impaired. So and exercise is known to improve sort of connections between neurons. So exercise is important. There are certain diets, especially diets that are rich in processed food, that can create a um, insulin spikes that um, are thought to play a role in the deposition of amyloid in Alzheimer's. So, avoiding sort of the typical American diet, uh, you um, that's rich in processed foods. That's important. As far as drugs go, we never had any drugs. The drugs that we had, like Aricept, were like taking Tylenol for arthritis. It was just like a band-aid. It was just something to treat the symptom, but it wasn't really treating the underlying problem. um, and that was true for many, many, many years. Last year, a drug was got accelerated FDA approval called lecanemab or Leqembi. It's a what they call a monoclonal antibody that clears amyloid plaques. Amyloid is like misfolded proteins that gum up the brain of Alzheimer's patients. And all the anti-amyloid drugs before um, failed. Some actually worsened Alzheimer's. So, but people had this belief, um, including Alzheimer, Alois, the German psychiatrist who basically, you know, named the disease or discovered the disease. He was named after him by another psychiatrist. I talk about that whole history, but he attributed Alzheimer's to plaques, another sort of protein, misfolded protein that result in tangles, plaques and tangles. That's the that's the title of the first part of the book. It's actually, my daughter asked me, why did you say of plaques and tangles rather than just plaques and tangles? And I said, because um, the plaques sort of are symbolic. Of course, they're plaques in the brain. The plaques are really more uh, the sort of, they point to all the awards that my father used to get. His work and sort of showing his decline, and the tangles are like tangled relationships that we had in our family that we had to navigate. Um, but anyway, but this new drug shows not a lot of benefit, but some benefit in not reversing Alzheimer's, but slowing the progression of Alzheimer's. And it's clear-cut benefit. So even people who don't believe in the amyloid hypothesis have been convinced that, yeah, this drug probably does work. But, you know, we still don't know what causes Alzheimer's. We don't really have an understanding of the genesis of it. Um, and we know what causes heart disease. It's pretty easy, right? You have cholesterol plaques and gum up the arteries, and the plaque rupture creates clot, blocks the artery, and heart attack. We know cancer is a proliferation of malignant cells. Alzheimer's, we still don't know, and I think that's one of the reasons why we don't have effective treatments. But this new drug is potentially, uh, effective, and there'll probably be more drugs. I talk a lot about that, the science of that, and what to expect. Sure. Right. So, where do they live? So, and they all live under the same roof? And she's your father's sister or your mother's sister? Your mother's sister, and she has, how old is she? Okay. And your parents are how old? Mid-60s. So, yeah. And how long has she had Alzheimer's? Yeah. Yeah. It sounds like she may have early onset Alzheimer's, which was the first patient Alzheimer the psychiatrist studied had early onset. Early onset is essentially exclusively a genetic disease. There's a specific mutation that causes um, the the Alzheimer pathology. Most Alzheimer disease is late onset. It's in people who tend to be in their 70s and 80s, like my dad. And early onset is like 50s and maybe early 60s. And for a long time, they were thought to be different diseases. But now we know that they're essentially the same disease. They may have slightly different genetic uh, basis. Uh, so late onset is not really primarily a genetic disease. It's more of an accumulation of insults to the brain. Um, and we don't fully understand, but we know some of the risk factors are like diabetes, uh, high blood pressure, heart disease, and some of the things I mentioned, like eating a good diet and exercise, that really helps with the late onset. But early onset patients are, for a long time, people thought this has to be a different disease because the early onset patients got so much worse before they died. And now we think the reason is that you're younger, you have more life. So, know, you can live long enough for the brain to really degenerate. Whereas when you're older, you might die of a heart attack or something else, get cancer. So maybe the Alzheimer pathology doesn't progress. Um, what you're asking about how to help, um, it's exceedingly hard to give you advice on. I just don't know what the dynamic is. But what your father is displaying is not completely foreign to me. It's something that people do often. They just don't want to deal with it. They don't want to, and they also, once they go through the experience of Alzheimer's, they don't want to talk about it. Excuse me. And you know, for me, I wanted to talk about it primarily. Now that it's over, in the hope that it could help people who are going through that journey to really understand it better, so maybe they'll be better caregivers than I was. Yeah, sure. Yes. Mm, yeah, yeah. No, no. I mean, he knew I wrote books because I'd published 3 prior books, and he was very proud of all of them, but he didn't. Um, yeah, I mean, my siblings and I were actually very fortunate. Um, yeah, there was a lot of drama. You'll see it in the book if you read the book. There's a lot of tension, there's a lot of division, disagreements. But in the end, you know, we had a common goal. We had our parents' best interest at heart, and and at the end of the day, maybe I was a bit of the odd man out in some ways. Um, I definitely was when it came to sort of some of the caregiving issues, like lying to my dad. Like I refused to do it for a long time. My brother would pull his hair out. Just tell him she's not being paid. Just tell him whatever he wants to hear to make him happy. And I would say, he's not as far gone as you think. And I knew I was like lying to myself. He was. Um, so that was, sorry, I lost my train of thought. Uh, say, but yeah, I mean, I think that there was there was a lot of uh, disagreements that. Uh, oh yeah, so a big disagreement was at the end of my father's life when we enrolled him in hospice, and I went along with it. I actually made the decision to enroll him in hospice, and then I started to vacillate because he wasn't done. I mean, it was very hard to watch him, just lying in bed, and we were well. The big issue was, do we continue to give him IV fluids? Right? You can live without food for a long time. Hospice nurses told me you can live for months without food. I still don't believe that. But you can't live without water for more than about 3 or 4 days. So you couldn't drink. So I I said, well, look, some of this maybe dehydration. Let's put an IV in. My brother's like, I don't think this is dehydration. Um, but okay, let's do it. My brother and I actually did it in my dad's bedroom. I didn't do it. My brother did it. Um, there's a whole scene of that. And we started the IV fluids, And then it was, okay, he's no better with the IV fluids. What do we do with them now? Do we continue them or do we turn them off? And that was like a big struggle at the end. I'm not gonna give away everything. So you can read the book and find out exactly. But yeah. So yeah, that's it. So yeah, great. Well, Clive just stood up, so I guess I will sit over there, and you know, I'm happy to sign any books if you like. And thanks for coming.